Right now, as you watch this, you might not be completely here. I know that sounds unsettling, but consider this. Modern physics suggests our universe operates across 11 dimensions, yet you only experience 4. If reality has 11 layers and you're moving through just 4 of them, what does that say about the completeness of your existence? Think of a character drawn on paper. They experience length and width, but remain oblivious to the air surrounding them, the third dimension that shapes their entire reality. You might be that character, embedded in a higher dimensional space you can't perceive. Edward Witten's M-theory didn't emerge from mystical speculation. It arose from mathematical necessity. The equations demanded 11 dimensions for our universe to function coherently. This means parts of you, aspects of your consciousness and identity, could extend into realms beyond your biological awareness. What's remarkable is how ancient mystical traditions and cutting-edge theoretical physics keep arriving at strikingly similar conclusions about consciousness transcending our perceived limitations. We're going to explore these convergences, not as believers or skeptics, but as curious investigators, examining genuine scientific possibilities about who you really are. In 1995, Edward Witten stood before a room of the world's most brilliant physicists and dropped what many consider the most revolutionary bombshell in modern theoretical physics. He announced that all 5 competing versions of string theory were actually the same theory, viewed from different angles. But here's the kicker. To make this unification work mathematically, reality couldn't just have the 4 dimensions we experience. It needed 11. This wasn't some wild speculation. This was M-theory, a mathematical framework so elegant and necessary that it emerged from the equations themselves, demanding extra dimensions whether we could perceive them or not. And what M-theory revealed about your existence is frankly staggering. Think about this. Right now, as you're watching this, you're not sitting in empty space, surrounded by solid objects. According to M-theory, you're embedded in a 3-dimensional membrane, what physicists call a brain, that's floating through a vast, higher dimensional space called the bulk. Imagine you're a character drawn on a piece of paper. You can move forward, backward, left, and right across the surface, but you can't step off the page. That's essentially your situation, except your page is a 3-dimensional sheet, floating in an 11-dimensional reality. But where are these extra dimensions hiding? The answer lies in something called compactification, and it's one of the most mind-bending concepts in physics. Picture a garden hose, viewed from far away. It looks like a 1-dimensional line, but get closer, and you realize it has width and depth wrapped around that line. Those dimensions were always there. They were just curled up so tightly, you couldn't see them from a distance. The same thing happens with space itself. At every point around you, in the air you breathe, in your body, in the screen you're looking at, 6 additional spatial dimensions are folded and twisted into structures so incredibly small, they make atoms look like solar systems. These aren't empty dimensions either. They're filled with vibrating strings. And how these strings vibrate in these hidden spaces determines everything about the particles and forces we experience in our 3-dimensional world. Here's where it gets really wild. Your brain, this 3-dimensional membrane you call reality, isn't alone. M-theory suggests that countless other brains float through this higher dimensional bulk, stacked like pages in an infinite book. Some of these brains might contain entire universes with their own physics, their own matter, their own versions of life. And they could be literally micrometers away from you, separated only by directions your senses cannot detect. Imagine standing in a room and knowing that just a fraction of an inch away, in a direction that doesn't exist for you, entire civilizations might be thriving on their own membrane. You can't reach them, see them, or interact with them because you're confined to your brain, like that character drawn on paper. But they're there, as real as you are, living their lives in parallel realities, separated by the thinnest of higher dimensional gaps. These brains, aren't static either. They can move, collide, and create ripples through the bulk that manifest as gravitational waves in our dimension. Some versions of M-theory suggest that what we call the Big Bang wasn't the beginning of everything. It was the result of two brains crashing together in higher dimensional space, creating the explosion of matter and energy that formed our observable universe. This raises profound questions about the nature of your existence. When we explored earlier how you might not be complete in this reality, we were touching on something M-theory makes mathematically explicit. If consciousness emerges from the complex patterns of information processing in your brain, and if those patterns exist in a reality that's fundamentally 11-dimensional, then asking whether your awareness is somehow touching those hidden dimensions isn't mysticism. It's a legitimate scientific question. Consider this: every thought you have, every memory you form, every decision you make happens through electrochemical processes that ultimately involve the fundamental particles and forces described by string theory. These processes occur in a reality where 6 extra dimensions are intimately woven into every point of space. Your neurons fire through interactions that are fundamentally 11-dimensional, even though your conscious experience feels 3-dimensional. This is exactly the kind of profound implication that most platforms won't explore deeply. The intersection of consciousness and dimensional physics touches on ideas too revolutionary for mainstream discussion. That's why I share the most cutting-edge insights through the Insights Academy newsletter, where we can dive into concepts that challenge everything you think you know about reality. Subscribers get exclusive access to research that's often years ahead of public discourse. Plus, right now, you'll receive a free copy of the Kabbalion, an ancient text that remarkably parallels many modern discoveries about the nature of reality. The connection between ancient wisdom and quantum mechanics isn't coincidence, and understanding this relationship might be crucial for grasping your true place in the cosmic order. What makes this even more extraordinary is that M-theory isn't science fiction, it's rigorous mathematics. When physicists work through the equations that describe the fundamental forces of nature, 11 dimensions aren't an option, they're a requirement. The math simply doesn't work with fewer dimensions. Reality demands this structure whether our brains evolved to perceive it or not. This creates a humbling realization about human perception. You don't experience the 11th dimension not because it isn't real, but because your senses evolved to navigate survival on a 3-dimensional brain. Your eyes detect electromagnetic radiation in a narrow frequency range because that's what helped your ancestors find food and avoid predators. Your sense of space developed to help you move through 3 dimensions because that's where the evolutionary game was played. But evolution is a local phenomenon. It optimized you for success on your particular brain, in your specific dimensional slice of reality. It never needed to give you access to the full scope of existence because the full scope of existence wasn't necessary for survival and reproduction. This suggests something remarkable. The part of you that feels incomplete, that senses there's more to existence than what you can directly experience, might not be psychological yearning or spiritual longing. It might be a dim recognition that your consciousness, emerging from fundamentally 11-dimensional processes, is somehow aware of its own dimensional confinement. The mathematics of M-theory forces us to confront the possibility that what you call you, your thoughts, your awareness, your sense of identity, might be like the tip of an iceberg, with vast portions of your existence extending into dimensions you cannot perceive, but somehow, at the deepest level, you know, are there. Here's something that will completely shift how you think about yourself. What you call you, that voice in your head, your personality, your memories, might be just the tip of an iceberg so vast that most of it exists completely outside your awareness. Carl Jung spent decades studying the human psyche, and what he discovered was revolutionary. He realized that what we think of as our self, our ego, our conscious mind is actually just a small fraction of who we really are. Jung called the totality of our being the self with a capital S, and it's radically different from what you might expect. Think about your dreams for a moment. In dreams, you're often someone slightly different, maybe braver, maybe more fearful, sometimes even a completely different person entirely. Jung realized these weren't just random neural firings. They were glimpses of other aspects of yourself, parts of you that exist, but don't fit into your waking personality. He called some of these aspects the shadow, not evil, but simply the parts of yourself that your conscious mind has rejected or never acknowledged. Jung went even further. He proposed that this deeper self extends beyond individual psychology, connecting to what he called the collective unconscious, a shared field of meaning and experience that links all human consciousness. In his later work, Jung suggested that the self might even transcend time itself, connecting different moments, identities, and according to his studies of Eastern philosophy, even different lifetimes, as expressions of a single, underlying pattern. This wasn't just psychological speculation. Jung was drawing from traditions that had mapped consciousness for thousands of years. In Vedantic philosophy, which emerged from ancient India, there's a concept called Atman, often translated as the true self. But Atman isn't your individual soul or personality. It's the infinite consciousness that appears to be individual but is actually universal, like sunlight streaming through different windows. Each window seems to contain its own light, but it's all the same sun. The Vedantic sages describe this with a startling metaphor. Imagine consciousness as an ocean and individual awareness as waves. From the wave's perspective, it seems separate, unique, with its own beginning and end. But from a deeper view, every wave is just the ocean expressing itself in temporary form. Your individual consciousness, according to this view, is infinity experiencing itself as you. The Gnostic traditions of early Christianity had their own way of understanding this multidimensional nature of consciousness. They taught that the soul becomes scattered across different dimensions and densities of reality, like white light passing through a prism and separating into different colors. Each color, each dimension, contains a fragment of your complete being, but most of these fragments remain invisible to ordinary awareness. Theosophy, which emerged in the 19th century, attempted to map these different layers systematically. They described human beings as having multiple bodies: physical, astral, mental, causal, and divine, each existing at different frequencies of reality. According to this model, your physical body is just the densest expression of a consciousness that extends through multiple dimensions simultaneously. Now, you might think this sounds like mystical speculation, but consider your own experience. Have you ever had a dream that felt more real than waking life? A moment where you seem to remember something that never happened in your current life? An intuition about someone that proved accurate even though you had no logical reason to know it? Modern neuroscience is beginning to provide frameworks that align surprisingly well with these ancient insights. Carl Pribram's holonomic brain model suggests that memory and perception work holographically, meaning that each part of the brain contains information about the whole, just like each fragment of a holographic plate can reconstruct the entire image. But here's where it gets really interesting. What if the brain doesn't generate consciousness at all? What if it's more like a radio receiver, tuning into signals that already exist in a field of consciousness? This isn't just philosophical speculation anymore. Researchers like Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose have proposed that consciousness might be a fundamental feature of reality itself, not something that emerges from complex neural activity. If consciousness exists as a field, like an electromagnetic field, then your individual awareness might be just one receiver among many. Other aspects of yourself could be tuned to completely different frequencies, existing in dimensions that your current awareness can't access directly. Think about moments when the boundaries of your normal awareness seem to loosen. In deep meditation, you might experience a sense of expansion that feels more fundamental than your everyday identity. In moments of profound silence, some people report a knowing that seems to come from beyond their individual mind. Sometimes, in crisis or extreme beauty, There's a sudden recognition, not a thought, but a direct knowing that you are far more than you normally experience yourself to be. These aren't glitches in consciousness, they're bleed-throughs, moments when the membrane between different layers of your being becomes permeable. Remember from our earlier discussion how M-theory suggests we live on a floating membrane in higher dimensional space. What if your consciousness works the same way, with most of your being existing in dimensions that only occasionally bleed through into your ordinary awareness? This has profound implications for those strange experiences that everyone has but rarely talks about. Déjà vu might not be a neural misfire, but a moment when your current awareness briefly synchronizes with another aspect of yourself that has already experienced this moment. Precognitive dreams might be glimpses from a part of your consciousness that exists outside linear time. That uncanny sense of knowing someone instantly might be recognition between aspects of consciousness that are already connected at levels beyond individual identity. Jung noticed that his patients often reported dreams or visions that seemed to contain knowledge they couldn't have acquired through normal means. He called this synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that suggest an underlying connectedness in reality. But what if synchronicity isn't coincidence at all? What if it's evidence of a deeper self that exists across multiple dimensions simultaneously, occasionally allowing different aspects of your being to communicate with each other? The next time you experience one of these moments, a dream that feels like a memory, an intuition that proves accurate, a sense of recognition with someone you've never met, pay attention. These might not be anomalies. They might be glimpses of the vast, multidimensional being that you actually are, most of which exists in realms you haven't learned to perceive yet. This isn't just about understanding yourself differently. If consciousness truly extends beyond individual boundaries, then the very nature of identity, relationship, and reality itself needs to be reconsidered. And that's exactly what we're going to explore next. How this multidimensional view of consciousness might explain some of the most mysterious aspects of human experience. Here's something that might fundamentally shift how you think about your own existence. What if your brain isn't creating your consciousness at all? What if it's simply receiving it, like a radio tuning into a signal that was already there? This isn't New Age wishful thinking. It's a serious challenge to one of science's most basic assumptions, coming from physicists, philosophers, and researchers who've spent decades studying the deepest mysteries of mind and matter. Let me start with David Bohm, the quantum physicist who worked alongside Einstein and developed some of the most profound insights into reality's hidden structure. Bohm proposed that everything we see and measure, what he called the explicate order, is just the surface layer of something far more fundamental. Beneath this visible world lies what he termed the implicate order, a dimension where everything is folded together, where separation dissolves, and the entire universe exists as an undivided wholeness. Here's where it gets fascinating. In Bohm's model, consciousness doesn't emerge from complex arrangements of matter. Instead, consciousness expresses through matter. The brain doesn't generate awareness any more than a piano generates music. It's an instrument through which something deeper plays itself into existence. This completely reverses our understanding of the mind-brain relationship. Instead of consciousness being this miraculous accident that somehow emerges when neurons reach sufficient complexity, consciousness becomes a fundamental aspect of reality itself, as basic as space, time, or energy. This connects to what philosophers call panpsychism. And before you dismiss it as the idea that rocks have feelings, let me explain what thinkers like Philip Goff are actually proposing. They're not suggesting that electrons have emotions or that stones contemplate existence. Rather, they're arguing that if consciousness is real and irreducible to purely physical processes, then it must be woven into nature's fabric from the ground up. Think of it like pixels on a screen. Individual pixels don't display complex images, but when organized in specific patterns under the right conditions, they create rich, detailed pictures. Similarly, matter itself might carry the potential for experience, basic units of consciousness that, under specific organizational conditions, like those found in brains, light up into the complex awareness we recognize as human experience. This radically reframes what your brain actually does. Instead of being a consciousness generator, it becomes more like a sophisticated receiver, lens, or tuning instrument, something that focuses and channels specific bandwidths of a consciousness field that extends far beyond your skull. And here's where the evidence gets genuinely intriguing. Consider the thousands of documented near-death experiences, where people report detailed perceptions from outside their bodies. Patients describe seeing their own surgery from the ceiling, overhearing conversations in adjacent rooms, providing specific details about events that occurred while they were clinically unconscious, details later verified by medical staff who had no prior contact with these individuals. Pam Reynolds, a musician who underwent brain surgery for a life-threatening aneurysm, had her body temperature lowered to 60 degrees. Her heart stopped, and all electrical activity in her brain ceased. Yet she later described in precise detail the surgical instruments used, conversations between surgeons, and even the music playing in the operating room, all while her brain showed no measurable activity. Now, these experiences don't necessarily prove life after death, but they do something equally profound. They challenge our fundamental assumption that consciousness dies with the brain. If awareness can exist and perceive when the brain is offline, then consciousness clearly operates by different rules than we've assumed. Remember our geometric metaphor from earlier sections. If consciousness can exist apart from the physical body, then what we think of as ourselves, our waking thoughts, linear memories, and everyday awareness might be like a shadow cast by a higher dimensional structure. Picture a three-dimensional sphere passing through a two-dimensional plane. The two-dimensional beings living on that plane would only see circles of varying sizes appearing and disappearing. They'd have no concept of the sphere itself, the fuller reality, casting these circular shadows into their world. Your everyday consciousness, with its stream of thoughts and memories, might be the circular shadow. The sphere, your fuller being, exists in higher dimensional space, connected to Jung's collective unconscious, to the quantum field, to what the Vedantic tradition calls pure awareness. And here's where M-theory's implications become staggering. We've established that our entire universe might be a membrane floating in 11-dimensional space. But why should consciousness obey different rules than everything else? If matter and energy can exist across dimensional boundaries, flowing between brains through the bulk space that contains them, then perhaps awareness does the same thing. Maybe consciousness is the connective tissue between dimensions, the field that remembers everything because, at its deepest level, it is everything. This would explain why precognitive dreams sometimes provide accurate information about future events that haven't happened yet in our timeline. If consciousness extends beyond our three-dimensional brain, it might access information from regions of higher dimensional space, where our future already exists. It would explain synchronicities, those meaningful coincidences that seem too perfectly timed to be random. If consciousness operates across dimensional boundaries, then what appears as separate events in our limited perspective might be connected through higher dimensional threads, invisible to our three-dimensional awareness. Most importantly, it explains that sense of presence you might have noticed, the awareness that watches your thoughts without being those thoughts, the observer that remains constant while everything else in your experience changes. That witnessing consciousness might be your actual self, existing in higher dimensional space and projecting into this reality, like light, through a lens. This isn't just philosophical speculation anymore. As we integrate insights from M-theory, quantum mechanics, neuroscience, and consciousness studies, we're approaching a revolution in understanding what you actually are. The boundaries between physics and consciousness, between individual and cosmic awareness, are dissolving. Your brain becomes less like the source of your consciousness and more like a sophisticated interface, the biological technology through which your higher dimensional self experiences this particular slice of reality. And if that's true, then exploring consciousness isn't just psychology or spirituality. It's the most practical physics research you could possibly engage in. Because understanding how consciousness actually works might be the key to understanding how reality itself operates across all dimensions. Have you ever woken up from a dream, feeling like you just lived an entire lifetime? Not the fleeting, fragmented dreams we usually dismiss, but those rare experiences where you inhabited a completely different existence, complete with relationships, memories, and emotional depths that felt more authentic than your actual life. I'm talking about dreams where you knew people you'd never met, navigated cities that don't exist on any map, yet every detail felt saturated with meaning and familiarity. These aren't just random neural firings during REM sleep. Something far more profound is happening here, and it connects directly to what we've been exploring about consciousness existing beyond the boundaries of your physical brain. When Jung wrote about the deeper self communicating through symbols and dreams, and when modern field theories suggest consciousness operates independently of neural activity, we're looking at the same phenomenon from different angles. Consider this. Children around the world regularly describe places they've never visited with startling accuracy. A 6-year-old in Ohio draws detailed maps of a village in rural Ireland, complete with the correct placement of a stone bridge that was demolished decades before their birth. A child in Japan speaks fluent Portuguese for 3 months, then suddenly stops, with no memory of ever knowing the language. These cases fill the files of consciousness researchers, yet mainstream science struggles to explain them because they challenge our fundamental assumptions about how memory and identity work. Dr. Ian Stevenson documented over 30 such cases during his career at the University of Virginia, focusing specifically on children who retained what appeared to be memories from other lives. But here's what's fascinating. When researchers dig deeper, many of these experiences don't fit the traditional reincarnation model either. Instead, they suggest something more like dimensional bleeding, moments where a child's consciousness briefly aligns with experiences existing in parallel streams of reality. The same pattern emerges in deep meditative states. Experienced practitioners consistently report dissolving not into nothingness, but into a larger presence that observes from beyond ordinary awareness. They describe meeting versions of themselves that feel simultaneously familiar and expanded, like encountering the same person but with access to wisdom and memories spanning far beyond their current lifetime. These aren't hallucinations or wishful thinking. Brain imaging during these states shows decreased activity in the default mode network, the neural circuit associated with self-referential thinking, and the maintenance of personal identity boundaries. Recent psychedelic research is revealing remarkably consistent patterns across altered states of consciousness. Participants regularly report experiences of hyperreality, states that feel more real and significant than ordinary waking consciousness. They describe encounters with aspects of themselves that seem both intimate and unfamiliar, often characterized as wiser, older, somehow existing beyond the flow of linear time. Dr. Robin Carhart Harris at Imperial College London found that psilocybin consistently produces what he calls ego dissolution, where the boundaries of personal identity temporarily dissolve, allowing access to what participants describe as their larger self. But these dramatic examples are just the visible peaks of a much larger phenomenon. Pay attention to the subtler experiences in your own life, those sudden emotional shifts that seem to come from nowhere, carrying feelings that don't match your current circumstances, or those moments of inexplicable attraction to places you've never visited, only to feel an overwhelming sense of homecoming when you finally arrive there. These aren't coincidences or projection. They're what we might call points of resonance, moments when your embodied consciousness briefly aligns with versions of yourself existing elsewhere in the dimensional landscape we've been mapping. Jung observed that the deeper self rarely communicates through direct verbal instruction. Instead, it speaks through symbols, synchronicities, and what he called meaningful coincidences, events that carry emotional significance far beyond their apparent cause. Ancient wisdom traditions understood this intuitively. They viewed dreams, visions, and sudden knowing as the soul speaking through signs. offering guidance from aspects of consciousness that never forgot their connection to the larger whole. Modern consciousness research is beginning to map these experiences systematically. Dr. Ibn Alexander's detailed documentation of his near-death experience, while in a medically induced coma, provided unprecedented scientific data about consciousness operating independently of brain function. His description of meeting a guide who felt like a deeper aspect of himself matches reports from meditation masters, psychedelic researchers, and individuals experiencing spontaneous mystical states across cultures and centuries. What's emerging is a picture of consciousness as fundamentally multidimensional, with our ordinary waking awareness representing just one frequency in a much broader spectrum. Those profound dreams, sudden intuitions that prove accurate, and moments of inexplicable knowing aren't anomalies interrupting normal consciousness. They're glimpses of the greater self that never fragmented, never forgot its connection to the larger field of awareness we explored in previous sections. Think about those intuitions that arrive fully formed before the events they describe. You know the feeling, a sudden certainty about something that hasn't happened yet, complete with emotional texture and specific details. When these prove accurate, we usually dismiss them as lucky guesses or pattern recognition. But what if they're actually moments when your consciousness briefly accesses information from probable futures or parallel presents? The implications are staggering. If consciousness operates as a field phenomenon, as we discussed earlier, then what we call you might be more like a radio receiver temporarily tuned to one station, while the full spectrum of your existence broadcasts simultaneously across multiple frequencies. Those edge experiences, the profound dreams, the sudden knowing, the inexplicable emotional resonances, aren't marginal interruptions. They're central invitations, glimpses of the greater self beckoning you to remember what you've always known but temporarily forgotten. The question isn't whether these experiences are real. The question is whether you're ready to take them seriously as genuine communications from the larger dimensions of your own being. In 1994, a psychology professor at Cornell University named Darrell Bem conducted an experiment that should have been impossible. He showed participants erotic images on a computer screen, measuring their physiological responses: heart rate, skin conductance, pupil dilation. Nothing unusual there. Except the computer didn't select which images to show until after it had already recorded their arousal responses. The participants were literally responding to stimuli that hadn't been chosen yet. When Bem published these results in 2011, the scientific community erupted. Not because his methodology was flawed, it was rigorous. Not because his statistics were wrong, they showed odds of 74 billion to 1 against chance. The uproar came because his results suggested something that challenges our most basic assumptions about time, causality, and the nature of consciousness itself. Bem's experiments have now been replicated in laboratories across 3 continents. At Northwestern University, researchers found that people's brains showed activity patterns that correlated with future events they couldn't possibly know about. In Amsterdam, scientists discovered that participants could unconsciously distinguish between future positive and negative images before those images were randomly selected. Each study used increasingly sophisticated controls to eliminate any possible conventional explanation. But precognition research represents just one thread in a tapestry of phenomena that suggests consciousness operates according to rules we're only beginning to understand. Remember how we explored the possibility that consciousness might be a fundamental field rather than something generated by your brain? These experiments hint at what that might actually look like in practice. Consider remote viewing, the ability to perceive distant locations without any conventional sensory input. For over 2 decades, Stanford Research Institute conducted classified research for the CIA, documenting cases where individuals provided startlingly accurate details about locations they'd never visited and had no possible way of knowing about. In one famous session, a remote viewer described a Soviet naval facility in unprecedented detail, including the presence of a massive submarine with an unusual hull design. Satellite imagery later confirmed not just the accuracy of the description, but revealed a new class of nuclear submarine that Western intelligence hadn't known existed. The researcher Russell Targ, who led many of these studies, documented hundreds of sessions where participants drew detailed sketches of target locations chosen randomly from sealed envelopes. Statistical analysis showed results that were millions to one against chance. When skeptics argued that subtle sensory cues might explain the results, researchers conducted sessions where the target locations weren't even chosen until after the remote viewing session was complete. The accuracy rates remained unchanged. What makes these findings even more intriguing is how they connect to experiences most of us have had but rarely discuss. That moment when you suddenly know who's calling before you check your phone. The inexplicable certainty about which route to take through an unfamiliar city. The recognition of someone you've never met but who feels immediately familiar. We typically dismiss these as coincidence or intuition. But what if they represent glimpses of consciousness, operating across dimensions we can't directly perceive? The phenomenon of terminal lucidity offers another compelling piece of this puzzle. Documented in medical literature for over 2 centuries, terminal lucidity describes cases where individuals with severe dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or significant brain damage suddenly regain complete mental clarity in the hours or days before death. They remember family members they hadn't recognized in years, engage in complex conversations, and display cognitive abilities that should be impossible given the extent of their brain deterioration. Dr. Michael Nahm at the Institute for Frontier Areas of Psychology has documented dozens of these cases. One patient, who hadn't spoken coherently in over 3 years due to advanced Alzheimer's, suddenly sat up the day before her death and had a detailed conversation with her daughter about family events spanning decades. Brain scans showed her neural tissue remained severely damaged even during these lucid periods. If consciousness were purely a product of brain activity, these recoveries should be neurologically impossible. These cases suggest that consciousness might operate independently of brain function in ways we don't fully understand. But how could information travel beyond the constraints of space and time? Quantum physics provides at least one mechanism we know exists in the physical world: entanglement. When 2 particles become quantum entangled, measuring the state of one instantly affects the other, regardless of the distance separating them. Einstein famously called this spooky action at a distance, because it seemed to violate the principle that nothing can travel faster than light. Yet experiments have now confirmed entanglement effects across distances of hundreds of kilometers, with the correlation occurring instantaneously, not just faster than light, but apparently outside the normal flow of time altogether. The Global Consciousness Project, run by Princeton University's engineering department, has been monitoring this possibility on a planetary scale since 1998. They maintain a network of random number generators around the world, devices that should produce completely unpredictable sequences of ones and zeros. But during major global events, the 9/11 attacks, the 2004 tsunami, the death of Princess Diana, these random generators worldwide begin showing subtle but statistically significant patterns, as if some kind of field effect were influencing physical processes across the planet. The morning of September 11th, 2001, the global network began showing unusual coherence patterns several hours before the first plane hit the World Trade Center. During the exact minutes of the attacks, the deviation from randomness reached levels that occur by chance less than once in a million trials. Similar patterns emerged during other events that captured worldwide attention, suggesting that collective human consciousness might create measurable effects in physical systems. Now, here's where this connects to the 11-dimensional framework we've been exploring. If consciousness operates across multiple dimensions simultaneously, then what we call precognition, remote viewing, or intuitive knowing might simply reflect the natural state of awareness, when it's not constrained by 3-dimensional limitations. Think about it this way. Imagine you're looking at a long, winding river from ground level. You can only see the small section directly in front of you. But if you could rise above the landscape, you'd see the river's entire course, where it's been and where it's going. Linear time might be similar, a local constraint of three-dimensional awareness. Higher dimensional aspects of consciousness could potentially access information from multiple temporal coordinates simultaneously, like viewing that river from above. This isn't mysticism. It's a logical extension of what M-theory suggests about the structure of reality. If you exist across 11 dimensions simultaneously, then the version of you reading these words represents just one slice of a much larger multidimensional being. Other aspects of yourself might have access to information from different temporal coordinates, different probability streams, or different dimensional perspectives entirely. The information occasionally bleeds through, that inexplicable knowing, that sudden certainty, that recognition of something you've never encountered before. What we call impossible knowing might actually be the most natural thing in the universe. Once we understand that consciousness isn't limited to the dimensional slice where we typically focus our attention, the implications stretch far beyond academic curiosity. If consciousness can indeed access information across space and time, then the boundaries we assume separate us from each other, from knowledge, and from possibilities might be far more permeable than we've ever imagined. There's something extraordinary happening inside your awareness right now that you've probably never fully examined. As you read these words, part of you is simultaneously watching yourself read them. There's an observer present, a witness to your own mental activity that remains mysteriously separate from the thoughts it observes. This isn't philosophical speculation. It's direct experience you can verify immediately. Notice how you can catch yourself thinking, how you can step back and observe your own reactions to ideas. When you're angry, something in you recognizes, "I am angry," without being consumed by the anger itself. When you're lost in worry, a part of you can suddenly notice, "I'm worrying," and create space around the anxious thoughts. Carl Jung called this the self with a capital S, distinct from the everyday personality or ego. Modern neuroscience has begun mapping what they call metacognitive awareness, consciousness, observing its own processes. But what neither fully explains is how this observer can sometimes seem to know things your ordinary mind doesn't, or why it occasionally feels like it's operating from a completely different dimensional perspective. The witness consciousness doesn't just observe, it often provides guidance that feels simultaneously intimate and impersonal. You know this experience. You're facing a complex decision, churning through pros and cons, when suddenly a clear knowing emerges that cuts through all the mental noise. It's not a voice or a thought exactly, but a recognition that feels more solid than any reasoning process you could construct. This guidance often arrives with perfect timing. The insight that solves a relationship conflict appears just when you need it. The creative solution to a work problem downloads complete during a morning shower. The warning about a situation surfaces as an inexplicable reluctance that later proves prophetically accurate. What's particularly fascinating is how this witness seems to operate from outside normal temporal constraints. It can sense patterns before they fully manifest, recognize the deeper currents beneath surface events, and sometimes provide information that your conscious mind has no logical way of knowing. Remember from our previous exploration how information appears to travel beyond normal time. This witness consciousness might be your personal access point to that phenomenon. During crisis moments, many people report a dramatic expansion of this observing presence. Time slows, emotional reactivity drops away, and a calm, clear intelligence emerges that seems far wiser than their usual personality structure. Emergency room doctors, soldiers in combat, and parents protecting children often describe accessing capabilities and knowledge that feel borrowed from some larger version of themselves. Meditation traditions have mapped this territory extensively. They describe how the witness initially feels like a subtle background presence, but with attention can be recognized as the most constant aspect of experience. Thoughts change, emotions shift, circumstances alter, but the witnessing awareness remains remarkably stable. It's the one thing about you that has remained essentially unchanged since childhood. The same quality of awareness looking out through your eyes now that was present when you were 7 years old. But here's where it gets really interesting. Sometimes this witness doesn't just observe, it seems to act through you. You find yourself saying exactly the right thing in a difficult conversation without planning your words. Your body moves with unusual grace and efficiency during physical challenges. You make a series of decisions that create outcomes far better than your conscious strategizing typically achieves. Artists and inventors know this phenomenon intimately. The melody that arrives complete, the mathematical proof that appears fully formed, the story that writes itself. These feel less like personal creation and more like reception from a source that transcends individual limitations. Nikola Tesla famously described seeing his inventions operating in his mind before building them, as if accessing blueprints from elsewhere. This might represent a form of dimensional communication. If aspects of your consciousness exist in higher dimensional space, as we've been exploring, then creativity could be how your everyday awareness receives transmissions from these expanded versions of yourself. The linear mind, with its step-by-step processing, suddenly gains access to solutions that seem to have bypassed normal thinking entirely. You can begin recognizing these patterns through careful observation. Notice the qualitative difference between forced thinking and received insight. Forced thinking feels effortful, circular, often anxious. Received insight arrives with a sense of rightness, often accompanied by physical relaxation or expansion. It doesn't argue for itself, it simply presents with quiet authority. Pay attention to moments when you seem to be lived rather than living. These are times when appropriate responses emerge without conscious decision-making, when you find yourself in exactly the right place at the right time, through a series of choices that seemed natural in the moment, but prove remarkably prescient in retrospect. Synchronicities often mark these moments, meaningful coincidences that provide exactly the information or connection you need. The book that falls open to the relevant passage, the overheard conversation that answers your unspoken question, the chance meeting that shifts your entire trajectory. These might be breadcrumbs left by higher dimensional aspects of yourself, operating from a perspective where past, present, and future are simultaneously visible. Dreams offer another access point. The solutions that arrive during sleep, the warnings that prove accurate, the creative inspirations that emerge from unconscious processing. These suggest that something in you continues working on problems from a broader vantage point when the everyday mind steps aside. Start paying attention to the quality of your awareness during different states. Notice how the witness feels during meditation versus crisis, versus creative flow. Observe when decisions seem to make themselves, versus when you struggle to choose. Track the difference between insights that arrive complete and ideas you have to construct piece by piece. The recognition doesn't require believing anything metaphysical. It simply asks you to observe consciousness as it actually operates rather than how you assume it works. The evidence is already present in your direct experience. You just need to start paying attention to what's been there all along. Your higher dimensional presence isn't some distant, mystical concept. It's the part of you that's reading these words right now with recognition rather than mere comprehension, the part that already knows what I'm describing because it's been operating through you your entire life, quietly, guiding, protecting, and creating from a perspective that transcends the limitations of linear awareness. Have you ever walked into a place you'd never been before and felt like you were coming home? Or heard a piece of music that moved you to tears despite having no personal connection to it? Maybe you've found yourself knowing things about historical periods or distant cultures with an intimacy that seems impossible given your actual experience. This isn't nostalgia or imagination. What you're experiencing might be memory, just not the kind your neuroscience textbooks talk about. The dominant scientific model tells us memory works like a filing cabinet in your brain. Experience goes in, gets processed, filed away in neural networks, and retrieved when needed. Clean, mechanical, contained within the 3 pounds of tissue in your skull. But this model has some pretty glaring problems that researchers are only beginning to acknowledge. Consider the documented cases of organ transplant recipients who develop completely new preferences after surgery. A classical musician receives a heart from a jazz enthusiast and suddenly finds himself drawn to Miles Davis. A vegetarian gets a liver from someone who loved meat and starts craving steaks. A shy accountant receives lungs from an adventurous rock climber and begins seeking out extreme sports. The medical establishment calls this coincidence or psychological suggestion, but when you dig deeper, you find recipients describing specific memories, preferences, and even personality traits that precisely match their donors they knew nothing about. Claire Sylvia, who received a heart and lungs from an 18-year-old motorcyclist, began craving beer and chicken nuggets immediately after surgery, despite having been health conscious her entire life. She later discovered these were her donor's favorite foods. If memory is just brain-based neural firing, how do you explain cellular memory? How does a heart remember what its previous owner loved? The answer might lie in something far more revolutionary than we've been willing to consider. What if memory isn't stored in your brain at all, but accessed through it? What if your brain functions more like a radio receiver, tuning into information that exists in fields of consciousness we're only beginning to understand? Recent research in epigenetics is revealing that traumatic experiences actually alter gene expression in ways that get passed down through generations. Holocaust survivors' children and grandchildren show genetic markers of trauma they never directly experienced. The descendants of famine victims carry metabolic changes that affect how their bodies process food, even when they've never known hunger. This suggests that information, including emotional and experiential information, can be inherited through biological mechanisms we're just discovering. But it goes deeper than genetics. Carl Jung spent decades documenting what he called the collective unconscious, a shared repository of human experience that manifests in symbols, patterns, and archetypal knowledge that appears across cultures with no direct contact. Jung noticed that his patients, regardless of their background, would produce remarkably similar images and symbols during deep psychological work. Mandalas, spirals, the wise old man, the great mother, these patterns emerged spontaneously from people who had never studied mythology or comparative religion. It was as if they were accessing a library of human experience that transcended individual biography. What Jung discovered aligns remarkably with the holographic model of consciousness we explored earlier. If consciousness operates holographically, then each individual awareness contains patterns of the whole. This means certain universal knowledge might be accessible not through learning, but through remembering information that exists in the deeper structures of consciousness itself. This explains why some philosophical or spiritual concepts feel immediately familiar when you first encounter them, why certain places evoke profound recognition, why some people seem to carry knowledge of historical periods with startling accuracy despite never having studied them formally. Indigenous cultures have always understood this. They speak of ancestral knowledge that lives within individuals, accessible through proper attention and practice. Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime, African ancestral wisdom, Native American spirit knowledge. These traditions recognize that individual consciousness connects to vast networks of information spanning generations and dimensions of experience. Méditation tradition describe similar phenomena. As awareness deepens beyond the surface level of personal thoughts and memories, practitioners report accessing what they describe as layers of memory, personal, collective, and cosmic levels of remembering. Advanced meditators sometimes describe experiencing historical events, understanding complex philosophical principles they've never studied, or accessing practical knowledge that seems to come from nowhere. What we call intuition might often be exactly this kind of memory, not of this life's experiences, but of information accessible to higher dimensional aspects of consciousness that exist beyond the constraints of linear time and individual biography. Consider how this relates to the 11-dimensional framework. In our 3-dimensional experience, memory is sequential, linear, stored, and retrieved in time. But consciousness operating in higher dimensions wouldn't be limited by these constraints. Memory in higher dimensions might be simultaneous and multifaceted, where all information exists as an accessible present rather than a stored past. If your consciousness extends across multiple dimensions, as the evidence strongly suggests, then what you experience as mysterious knowing or ancient memory might simply be your higher dimensional awareness, accessing information from other aspects of yourself or from the collective field of human experience. This has profound practical implications. That inexplicable familiarity with certain people might be recognition operating from dimensions where your connection already exists. The spontaneous emergence of skills during crisis situations might be your expanded awareness accessing knowledge from the collective human repository of experience. Even your deepest fears and attractions might not be entirely personal. They could be echoes from the vast network of human experience that your consciousness naturally connects to, information flowing through the quantum field that connects all awareness. The watchers within that we discussed earlier, those aspects of your consciousness operating beyond ordinary awareness, they don't just observe your current experience. They have access to the full spectrum of information available to consciousness itself. What feels like memory beyond your brain might be exactly that. Memory beyond your brain, accessed through the higher dimensional aspects of your being that exist in realms where all information is eternally present. This changes everything about how you understand knowing, learning, and the nature of your own awareness. You're not just accessing your personal database of experience, you're connected to the infinite library of consciousness itself. So you've glimpsed the watchers within, those higher dimensional aspects of yourself that have been present all along. You've felt the pull of ancient memories that seem to belong to someone else, yet resonate with undeniable familiarity. Now comes perhaps the most crucial question. How do you actually live with this awareness without losing your footing in the 3-dimensional world that still demands your attention? I've watched people discover these expanded aspects of consciousness and immediately want to escape into them, abandoning practical responsibilities, as if the physical world suddenly became irrelevant. That's not integration, that's spiritual bypassing. The real mastery lies in becoming more effective in ordinary reality, not less, because you're drawing from a fuller spectrum of your own intelligence. Think of it this way. You've discovered you have access to a vast library of wisdom and perspective that exists beyond your everyday mind. The question isn't whether to live in the library or in the world, it's how to become a bridge between them. This is where the rubber meets the road in multidimensional living. Let's start with decision-making, because this is where most people first notice the practical difference. Instead of forcing choices through mental analysis alone, weighing pros and cons until your head spins, you learn to create space for a broader perspective to emerge. I'm not talking about abandoning rational thinking. I'm talking about expanding it. Before important decisions, I've learned to create what I call dimensional space. This means stepping back from the urgency of immediate analysis and allowing stillness. In that stillness, something interesting happens. Your body begins to respond differently to various options. One choice might generate a sense of expansion, energy, and possibility. Another might create contraction, heaviness, or a subtle sense of wrongness that has nothing to do with logical analysis. This isn't mystical wishful thinking. You're learning to recognize signals from aspects of consciousness that process information differently than your analytical mind. That higher dimensional awareness we discussed, it's not separate from you. It's a more expanded version of you, with access to patterns and connections your everyday consciousness might miss. Here's what this looks like practically. You're considering a job offer. Logically, it makes sense. Better pay, good benefits, reasonable commute. But when you sit quietly and imagine yourself in that role, your body contracts slightly. There's a subtle sense of life force diminishing. Meanwhile, another opportunity that looks less impressive on paper generates energy and excitement that seems to come from somewhere deeper than surface preferences. Traditional advice tells you to ignore those irrational responses. Multidimensional wisdom suggests they might be the most rational responses of all, coming from aspects of your consciousness that can perceive the fuller implications of your choices. This understanding transforms how you approach challenges. Instead of seeing problems as obstacles to overcome through force or strategy alone, you begin to recognize them as invitations for different aspects of yourself to contribute solutions. The part of you that excels at logical analysis tackles certain elements. The part that understands emotional dynamics addresses relational components. And sometimes, solutions emerge from that expanded awareness that your everyday mind never would have conceived. I remember working with a client who was struggling with a business partnership that had become increasingly difficult. Every logical approach to resolve the conflict had failed. During one of our sessions, she accessed that deeper perspective we've been discussing. Instead of focusing on changing her partner or defending her position, she suddenly saw the entire dynamic from a completely different angle. The solution that emerged wasn't something she could have thought her way to. It required recognizing patterns that were invisible from her ordinary viewpoint. This perspective revolutionizes relationships. When you recognize that you exist across multiple dimensions of consciousness, you begin to perceive the same multidimensional nature in others. That difficult person in your life, yes, they're displaying challenging personality patterns and behaviors. But there are other aspects of them operating simultaneously, aspects that might be more accessible if you learn to recognize and relate to them. This doesn't mean ignoring problematic behavior or abandoning healthy boundaries. It means recognizing that the person you're dealing with in ordinary reality is one expression of a more complex, multidimensional being, just as you are. Sometimes, relating to someone's deeper essence can shift the entire dynamic in ways that addressing surface-level personality patterns never could. Creative work becomes particularly interesting from this perspective. Instead of seeing creativity as something you do through effort and technique alone, it becomes a form of dimensional collaboration. Your everyday self, with its skills, knowledge, and ability to function in three-dimensional reality, serves as a conduit for inspiration and insight flowing from expanded aspects of consciousness. Many artists and innovators describe this experience without necessarily using multidimensional language. They talk about ideas that seem to come from somewhere else, solutions that appear fully formed, creative breakthroughs that feel more like discoveries than inventions. When you understand consciousness as multidimensional, these experiences make perfect sense. You're not channeling some external source. You're accessing aspects of your own expanded awareness. The balance between receptivity and agency becomes crucial here. You learn to receive guidance and inspiration from these expanded aspects while maintaining personal responsibility and discernment. This isn't about abandoning critical thinking or personal will. It's about recognizing that your critical thinking and personal will operate most effectively when informed by the fuller spectrum of your consciousness. I've seen people fall into several traps during this integration process. Some become so fascinated with expanded states that they lose interest in practical effectiveness. Others use spiritual concepts to avoid taking responsibility for their choices and circumstances. The key is developing what I call dimensional literacy, the ability to recognize which level of consciousness is most appropriate for different situations. When you're balancing your checkbook, you need focused analytical attention. When you're sensing whether someone is trustworthy, you might need to access more intuitive aspects of awareness. When you're making major life decisions, you want input from the fullest spectrum of your consciousness. Learning to consciously shift between these different modes of awareness is a practical skill that improves with practice. This understanding transforms how you approach learning and growth. Instead of seeing development as accumulating new information or skills, You begin to recognize it as remembering and integrating aspects of yourself that were always present, but not always accessible. That ancient memory we explored earlier, it's not separate from your current learning. It's part of the vast intelligence you're gradually remembering how to access. Living as a multidimensional being brings both profound humility and quiet confidence. Humility, because you recognize the vastness of what remains unknown and the limited perspective of your everyday consciousness. Confidence, because you're learning to trust the deeper wisdom that operates beyond ordinary mental capacity. The integration of multidimensional awareness isn't about escaping ordinary reality. It's about bringing the full spectrum of your consciousness to bear on the beautiful, challenging, complex experience of being human. In our final section, we'll explore what this means for the future of human consciousness and your role in that unfolding story. We've traveled quite a journey together through these dimensions of consciousness, haven't we? From the quantum mechanics showing us reality's malleable nature, through those ancient memories that feel older than our bodies, to practical ways of living as multidimensional beings. Each perspective we've explored, whether cutting-edge physics or timeless mystical insight, keeps pointing towards something that ultimately transcends every framework we can construct around it. Here's what's fascinating. The more we investigate consciousness through any lens, the more we discover that we're not actually finding consciousness somewhere out there in higher dimensions. Instead, we're recognizing that consciousness might be the very capacity that allows dimensions to exist in the first place. It's like spending years searching for the screen that movies are projected on, only to realize you've been looking at it the entire time. Think about this for a moment. When physicists probe deeper into reality, what do they consistently find? That the observer plays a fundamental role in determining what gets observed. When mystics explore the depths of meditation, what do they discover? That the seeker and the sought are the same awareness. When neuroscientists study the brain, what remains mysteriously elusive? The actual experience of being aware, that irreducible fact of consciousness that makes all their observations possible. This transforms the entire question of identity, doesn't it? Instead of asking, who am I across all these dimensions? We start asking, what is the nature of this awareness that's capable of asking any question at all? It's the difference between trying to locate yourself within existence and recognizing yourself as the very capacity for existence to be experienced. The ancient traditions called this the groundless ground, an awareness so fundamental that it doesn't depend on any particular structure for its existence. Not the first dimension, not the 11th dimension, not infinite dimensions. It's what allows the very concept of dimension to make sense. It's like asking, what color is the space that contains all colors? Or what shape is the emptiness that allows all shapes to appear? Now, this recognition brings something profound, both radical freedom and profound responsibility. Freedom, because you're no longer trying to fix, heal, or complete some limited aspect of yourself. The awareness reading these words right now isn't broken, isn't missing anything, isn't waiting to evolve into something better. It's already the deepest truth, regardless of which dimensions it might be experiencing through. But with this freedom comes responsibility. If this unlimited awareness is expressing itself through the particular form of your life, then how that expression unfolds matters deeply. Not because you need to achieve some spiritual goal, but because this moment, with all its apparent limitations and possibilities, is how infinite consciousness is choosing to know itself right now. Here's the beautiful paradox that emerges. All our seeking for the higher self in expanded dimensions might ultimately reveal that there was never anything to seek. The awareness that got curious about the 11th dimension, the consciousness that resonated with ancient memories, the being that learned to navigate multidimensional existence, this was always the very thing it was looking for. This understanding completely transforms how we relate to death, doesn't it? Not because consciousness continues in some other dimension, though it might, but because we recognize it was never actually confined to any dimension in the first place. What was never born cannot die. What was never fragmented doesn't need healing. What was never lost doesn't need to be found. You can see this recognition appearing across every wisdom tradition, expressed in their unique languages, but pointing to the same mystery. The Vedantic, I am that I am. The Buddhist recognition of original nature. The mystical Christian understanding of being in the world, but not of it. The indigenous knowing of being both the dreamer and the dream. But here's what makes this practical rather than just philosophical. You don't need to choose between being this infinite awareness and fully engaging with multidimensional existence. In fact, the deeper this recognition goes, the more freely you can play in all the dimensions of experience. You can explore past life memories without needing them to define you. You can develop psychic abilities without making them your identity. You can have profound mystical experiences without grasping after them. It's like being an actor who's so secure in their real identity that they can completely inhabit any role. The more you know yourself as this fundamental awareness, the more fully you can experience being human, being multidimensional, being whatever this moment is calling forth. This is why some of the most awakened beings appear remarkably ordinary. They're not trying to be spiritual or multidimensional or enlightened. They're simply allowing this infinite awareness to express itself naturally through the unique circumstances of their lives. They're both the eternal witness and the evolving personality, both the unchanging awareness and its dynamic expressions. So as we conclude this exploration, consider this. What if the 11th dimension, like all the others, is just another playground for this awareness that you fundamentally are? What if every dimension, every experience, every moment of seeking and finding is just consciousness playing with itself, exploring its own infinite nature through apparently limited forms? The invitation isn't to transcend your humanity, but to recognize what was never bound by it. Not to escape dimensions, but to dance freely through them all. Not to become something greater, but to recognize the greatness that's been reading these words all along. Rest in this recognition while fully engaging with the magnificent play of existence. Live as both the infinite awareness and its temporary expressions. Be both the eternal witness and the evolving story. This is your true nature beyond all dimensions, not located anywhere, not confined to anything, but the very capacity for everything to be experienced. If this video resonated with you, let us know by commenting, "I understood it."